Some people talk about the fact that higher interest rates, as set forth by Powell and the Federal Reserve, meant to decrease demand, borrowing expansion, actually adds gasoline, if you will, to inflation because with higher rates, those who have assets and have money, there's more money, more returns coming to them, higher than before. I mean, the risk-off rate today in treasuries is what, 5.25, 5.5-ish. And yet, what, 3 years ago, it was, down next to zero. What do you see that as part of the inflationary aspect, that higher rates is not assisting in reducing inflation, or where does that balance out for you?
Well, okay, so there are a couple of things here to note, and they look contradictory, but what they really are is they're at different places of how the cause and effect relationship plays out. Number one, inflation is the ratio of money in circulation to goods and services. So the more money you have juxtaposed to the goods and services, the higher price. There's more money to allocate to those goods and services. But as you continue on in a higher rate environment, as you note, they can participate in keeping inflation sticky, because those borrowing costs, as they get higher, sometimes corporations will, first of all, you do have people with returns that'll keep spending, but corporations will also, push those costs through to consumers by raising prices. And so it can participate in those ways, but you have the first effect, and then you have sort of the secondary and tertiary effects of inflation. But that is one of the reasons that inflation can remain quite sticky, because those costs will very stubbornly go down. Now, if you have a situation where the money supply suddenly drops, which is what you had in the financial crisis, because people couldn't service the debt, and so those loans had to be written off, and writing those loans off removes them from the system. And so you had this massive drop in the money supply. You actually did have a massive deflationary impact, despite the fact that, they were raising into the start of the financial crisis. So it's hard to kind of pick these pieces apart. But when you look at, the primary cause and effect, the secondary cause and effect, the tertiary cause and effect, you can see a progression of the cycle. It still is not perfect to predict when the shoe is going to drop and which shoe is going to drop. And the reason is that every time a piece of debt is created, that's adding to the money supply. So in this particular cycle with COVID, they put so much liquidity into the system, which is debt, right? But even though the Fed has raised rates, which ultimately disincentivize borrowing, and borrowing equals new liquidity, even though they've done that, you had banks with commercial industrial loans go down, but you had massive fiscal stimulus coming in. You had private credit coming in to take the place of those banks and those commercial and industrial loans. So instead of having those loans default, they were restructured into a private credit, which means you're not having that defaulting mechanism of dropping the money supply. And then thirdly, you had people that lower 60% putting groceries on credit cards. And when you put groceries on credit cards, you're entering new debt and new liquidity into the system, rather than spending out of your salary, which has already been in the system, or your savings, which has already been entered into the system. So you had these three forces really stretch out the business cycle, which was surprising. I mean, almost everybody, the consensus certainly was we expect a recession with rates going up so high, so fast. And, in hindsight, these three things were able to sort of elongate this season of the business cycle.
Is your retirement plan on pace to get you to where you want to go in the time you want to get there? How do you know? Whose advice are you taking? And more importantly, what measurables or metrics are you using to measure your progress? I learned many, many years ago to depend upon myself for creating my financial future, my financial freedom. And I started out with tangible assets, not unlike our own businesses, our practices, but having a plan B that at some point would replace the income that I had to earn to pay for my lifestyle, my family security. It takes some time to do that, but converting your investable capital into tangible assets, I believe the time is now more than ever. The financial models of the past, the traditional tax-deferred programs like 401ks and cash balance plans, defined benefit programs, that's not going to be the way of the future. You might have some money there, but really hard assets is where you need to be to offset the inflation and have the predictability of the income that you need to provide the security that you need for the rest of your life. I'm hosting a webinar next Thursday, August 1st, where I will break open the principles that I've used for many, many years to build my own freedom and helping many other professional practice owners and their spouses as couples to create the same freedom and have the same peace of mind and security that everybody's looking for today. If you'd like to know more about how to do this and how I can help you, just join me on the webinar next Thursday, August 1st. I'll be glad to open the door and show you the principles and the strategies and even the tactics that we're using today to offset the volatility of the economics and political environment that we find ourselves.